"Grandpa, can we cut the cake now?" My grandson smiled. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law grabbed the chocolate cake, threw it into the trash, and yelled, "My mother only eats vanilla. This garbage doesn't belong on this table." Everyone stayed silent until my son stood up. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I stood there with the cake server still in my hand, frosting on the blade, watching chocolate crumbs slide down the inside of the trash can like something out of a dream I hadn't woken up from yet. The whole room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet right before something breaks completely, the kind of silence you can feel pressing against your eardrums. That cake had taken me 3 hours that morning, and it wasn't really about the baking. It was my late wife's recipe, the same one she'd made for our son's birthday every single year until the cancer took her 4 years ago. And I still knew the measurements by heart because she used to make me repeat them back to her like a test, laughing every time I got the baking soda wrong. My grandson had helped me crack the eggs that morning, his tongue poking out in concentration, so careful not to let any shell fall in. And for those few hours in the kitchen, I'd felt her standing next to me again, the way I always did whenever that recipe came out of the drawer. It wasn't just cake, it was the last conversation I still knew how to have with her. My granddaughter had insisted on measuring the cocoa powder herself, her small hands trembling with the effort of holding the measuring cup level, and when a little of it spilled across the counter, she looked up at me in a panic like she'd committed some terrible crime. I told her it was perfect, that a real baker always spills a little, and she beamed so wide I thought her face might split. We'd written happy birthday on top in wobbly icing letters, her hand guiding mine, and when it came out of the oven, dark and rich and smelling like the whole kitchen had been dipped in it, I'd felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I'd carried it to the table myself, careful with every step, the way you carry something you know you can't replace. I set it down in the center between the plates and the paper crowns the kids had made, and for one golden minute before anyone noticed anything was wrong, it just sat there looking beautiful. Now it was in the garbage, and my daughter-in-law was still breathing hard from the throw, her chest rising and falling, one hand still curled from where she'd gripped the plate. "She's allergic," her mother said from her seat at the table, arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Not concerned, not worried the way a mother would look if her daughter had actually eaten something dangerous. Amused, like she'd been waiting all evening for exactly this moment, and it had finally arrived right on schedule. I looked at my son. He hadn't moved yet, and for the first time all night, I couldn't read his face at all. My brother was there, sitting near the window with his fork still halfway to his mouth, frozen mid-bite. My son's neighbor and his wife, invited because they'd become close over the years, sat across the table with their mouths slightly open. My granddaughter had gone completely still, her own fork hovering over the vanilla sheet cake nobody had touched, the one I'd made as a backup just in case anyone couldn't eat chocolate, which suddenly felt like the cruelest kind of foresight. My grandson, the one who'd asked the question that started all of this, looked between the trash can and his mother like he was trying to work out which one of them was lying to him. This wasn't the first time my daughter-in-law's mother had made her disapproval of me known. It had never been loud before, never anything you could point to directly. It was the way she'd look past me at family gatherings like I were a piece of furniture someone had forgotten to remove. It was the comments about how a man my age should really be in some kind of community by now, somewhere with other old people, somewhere that wasn't underfoot. It was the way she'd corrected my son once, gently, in front of everyone, for spending his Sunday afternoon fixing my gutters instead of taking her daughter to brunch. Small things, deniable things, the kind of thing that, taken one at a time, you could convince yourself you'd imagined. My daughter-in-law had been different once, warmer. In the early years, she used to call just to check on me, used to bring the kids over on weekends without being asked, used to sit at my kitchen table and ask me questions about my late wife like she genuinely wanted to know the woman who'd raised the man she loved. Somewhere along the way that had faded, replaced by a politeness so careful it felt rehearsed, and I told myself it was just the exhaustion of raising 2 young kids, just the way marriages settle and families get busy. I never once considered that someone might be working on her the way water works on stone, patient and constant and invisible, until the shape of the thing has already changed. 9 years, my son finally said, quiet and even, and something in his voice made the whole table go stiller than it already was. 9 years of birthdays and holidays, and this is the first I'm hearing about an allergy. His mother-in-law's smile flickered, just barely, but I caught it. "Watch your tone," she said, setting her wine glass down with a click against the table that seemed too loud in the silence. "This is a family celebration, not the time to make a scene over cake." "Nobody made a scene," my son said. "You did. Both of you did. That cake didn't have chocolate in it 30 seconds ago. Now it's in the trash, and I'm supposed to believe this was about an allergy nobody's ever mentioned in 9 years of knowing us." My daughter-in-law's face drained white, then flushed a deep blotchy red. "Excuse me? You're taking his side? Over your own wife's mother?" "I'm not taking a side," he said, and his voice hadn't risen at all, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "I'm asking a question. Where was this allergy at our wedding? When your mother ate the chocolate groom's cake off my plate? Where was it last Christmas, when she had 2 slices of the Yule log Dad made? I remember because I remember everything you two do, even when I pretend not to." The table had gone so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My grandson had crawled halfway into my granddaughter's lap without either neither of them seeming to notice, the way small children do when the air in a room turns dangerous, some animal instinct telling them to make themselves smaller. Her mother's composure slipped another notch. "You're accusing my daughter of lying at her own son's birthday party. I'm asking why my father's cake, made with my mother's recipe, from the woman who isn't here anymore to defend herself, ended up in the trash the second it hit the table," my son said. "I'm asking why that felt necessary tonight of all nights." "Because it's garbage," my daughter-in-law snapped, some of her old fire returning, though I noticed her eyes wouldn't quite land on mine. "Homemade, lopsided, probably underbaked in the middle. My mother deserves better than something thrown together by—" She stopped herself, but not soon enough. The word she hadn't said hung in the air anyway, and I felt it land somewhere under my ribs. "By what?" my son asked quietly. "Finish the sentence." Nobody finished it. Her mother's mouth had pressed into a thin, satisfied line, like she was watching a play reach exactly the scene she'd written for it. My son stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and for a moment he just stood there looking at the woman he'd shared a home with for 9 years, like he was seeing something he'd never quite let himself see before. Then he turned, and I watched him look past his wife entirely, straight at her mother. "I respect you," he said, and his tone was almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder. "But it's time for you and your daughter to leave my house." The room seemed to tilt. My daughter-in-law's mouth fell open. "What did you just say to my mother?" "You heard me," he said, still not raising his voice. "It's time to go." She came around the table fast, her hand already rising, and for one terrible frozen second, I genuinely believed she was going to strike me, or him, or maybe both of us, her fury too large now to aim anywhere in particular. My son stepped in front of me before I could even flinch, solid as a door someone had bolted shut, and looked down at her with something in his voice I don't think I'd ever heard from him in 31 years of being his father. "You will never disrespect my father again." It wasn't a threat. It didn't need to be. It was a fact he was stating into existence. The same way you'd state that the sun rises in the east, and something about the flatness of it seemed to knock the wind out of her more than shouting ever could have. She sputtered, looked at him, then at her mother, then back at him again, waiting for someone, anyone, to blink first. Nobody did. Her mother rose from her chair with the unhurried dignity of someone who believed she'd already won something, grabbed her purse off the back of the chair, and hissed, "Come on, we're clearly not wanted here." She took her daughter by the arm and pulled her toward the door hard enough that my daughter-in-law nearly stumbled over her own heels. At the threshold, her mother turned back one final time, and there was nothing amused in her face anymore, just something cold and calculating that I wouldn't understand the full weight of for weeks yet. "We'll see how long this little fantasy of a family lasts," she said, and then the door slammed behind them hard enough to rattle the picture frames in the hallway, one of them tilting a full inch off its nail. For a long moment, nobody in that dining room moved at all. My grandchildren stared at the closed door, small and pale, the birthday candles on the untouched vanilla sheet cake still faintly smoking. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the trash can, at the ruin of everything I'd spent that morning trying to give my son. My brother was the first to move. He came around the table and put a hand on my shoulder, heavy and steady the way he'd done since we were kids, and I was the one who got rattled easier. "You okay, old man?" he asked, low enough that only I could hear it. I could only manage a weak nod. I didn't trust my voice yet. The couple from next door sat frozen for a moment longer, then quietly started gathering the kids' paper crowns and party favors off the table, giving their hands something to do that wasn't reaching for me with pity in their eyes, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. My granddaughter had climbed fully into my lap without either of us discussing it, her small arms wrapped around my neck, and I held onto her like she was the only solid thing left in the room. My son stood with his back to all of us, staring at the door his wife had just been dragged through, his shoulders rigid, his hands opening and closing at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them, now that there was nothing left to hold back. I could see the tension radiating off him even from across the room, the particular stillness of a man working very hard not to let something crack open in front of his children. "Daddy?" my grandson said, small and uncertain, tugging at his father's sleeve. "Is Mommy coming back?" My son knelt down to his level, and whatever storm had been on his face a moment ago smoothed itself into something gentler before he answered. "I don't know yet, buddy," he said honestly, "but you and your sister are safe, and Grandpa's safe, and that's what matters right now, okay?" My grandson nodded, though his eyes kept drifting back toward the door like he expected it to open again any second. I finally let myself look at the trash can. The cake sat crumpled at an angle, frosting smeared against the plastic liner, and something about seeing it there, ruined and discarded like garbage, made my throat close up in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't really about the cake. It had never really been about the cake. It was about the fact that the last thing my hands had made with love that morning had been treated exactly like something worthless, in front of everyone, on purpose. I don't know how long I sat there staring at it before my son crossed the room without a word. He crouched down at the sink, pulled the trash can toward him, and without a word began scraping the clean top layer of the ruined cake into a mixing bowl, working around the parts that had touched the plastic liner, salvaging what he could with the same careful patience he must have learned from watching his mother do 100 small things in that same kitchen growing up. "What are you doing?" I finally managed to ask. "Saving what's left," he said simply, not looking up. I watched him scrape off the frosting that had smeared against the trash bag, working the knife along the intact center where the cake was still soft and dark and untouched by anything but its own weight. When he'd salvaged as much as he could, he set the bowl on the counter, cut himself a generous slice, and carried it back to the table. Then, in one deliberate motion, he set the plate down in the exact chair his wife had been sitting in 10 minutes earlier. Nobody said anything. The message didn't need explaining. "It's still Mom's cake," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word Mom, the first genuine crack in his composure since the whole ordeal had started. He took a bite, and I watched his eyes go glassy and bright. "Tastes just like hers, Dad." My granddaughter, with the simple bravery of a 7-year-old who'd decided the scary part of the evening was over, asked if she could have a piece too. My grandson asked right after her. My son cut them each a small square, and for a few minutes we passed that half-rescued cake around the table while the two kids forgot to be frightened and started giggling about frosting ending up on each other's noses, the sound of it loosening something tight in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. My brother caught my eye across the table and gave me a small nod, the kind that meant he understood exactly what this small, stubborn act of salvage was actually about. It wasn't about the cake tasting good, though it did. It was about my son refusing to let one woman's cruelty be the last word on a night that was supposed to be about him. It was about him choosing, in the middle of the wreckage, to protect the one thing that still meant something. We sang Happy Birthday a second time that night, quieter than the first, over the vanilla sheet cake nobody had wanted an hour earlier, and it felt different than it should have. Subdued, careful, like everyone in that room understood we were only getting through the motions of a celebration that had already been ruined, and doing it anyway because the alternative was letting two people who'd already left the house win twice in one evening. I went home that night to an empty house that felt colder than it had in months, and I lay awake a long time replaying the sound of the cake hitting the side of that trash can. I didn't hear from anyone for 4 days after that. I told myself it was fine, that everyone needed time, that storms like that one didn't clear themselves overnight. But the silence had a texture to it I didn't like, the kind that makes you start rehearsing conversations in your head just to have something to fill the quiet with. On the 5th day, my son finally called. His voice sounded thinner than usual, worn down at the edges. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, son." I tried to keep my own voice light. "I just wanted to check on you. How are you holding up?" There was a pause long enough that I almost asked if he was still there. "She and our son went to stay with her mother for a few days," he finally said. "Our daughter's with me. It's just been quiet here." The news landed harder than I expected. I'd imagined a lot of outcomes for that week, but not this one. Not my son alone in that big house with only one of his 2 children. The other one currently under the roof of the woman who'd started all of this. "Are you doing okay?" I pressed. "I'm processing," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion folded into those 2 words. "I keep going over it, Dad. I keep asking myself if I should have seen it sooner. The way she'd get quiet whenever her mother called. The way she started finding reasons we couldn't make it to your place on Sundays anymore. I didn't want to believe it was anything. I just thought we were busy. You have nothing to apologize for," I told him firmly. "You stood up for what was right. I've never been prouder of you in my whole life." "Hero," he said with a short, humorless laugh. "I just told my wife's mother to get out of my house. It shouldn't have needed to be some big brave thing. It should have been the easiest thing in the world. Instead, it started a war I don't know how to end. It was the right thing to do," I said, "and I'm sorry it cost you this much to do it. This was supposed to be a happy night for you." "It was," he said, quieter now. "I felt her in every bite of that cake, Dad. You gave me that. Whatever else happened after, you gave me that, and I need you to know it mattered." We talked a while longer, but I could hear how tired he was underneath it, and I let him go before the conversation wore either of us down further. I sat in my kitchen after we hung up, staring at the chair where my wife used to sit, feeling the particular loneliness of a house built for 2 people now holding just one. I didn't know yet that the quiet week I was sitting through was only the beginning of something much larger, working itself loose beneath the surface, something none of us could see clearly yet from where we were standing. It was a Tuesday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the party, when I heard a car pull into my driveway that wasn't my son's. I set down the book I hadn't really been reading and looked out the front window, and there she was, standing beside her car like she wasn't sure her legs would carry her the rest of the way to my porch. She looked different than I remembered from that night. No makeup, hair pulled back in a messy knot, wearing jeans and an old t-shirt instead of anything put together, the kind of clothes you wear when you've stopped trying to perform for anyone. Her eyes were swollen, the puffy red kind that comes from days of crying rather than one bad afternoon. She knocked, and I stood at my own door for a long moment before I opened it, the memory of her hand rising toward me still fresh enough that some old animal part of me hesitated. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from her before. "I need to tell you something, please." I thought about my late wife, about the kind of grace she always extended even to people who hadn't earned it yet, and I stepped aside to let her through the door. She sat on the edge of my couch like she didn't believe she'd earned the right to lean back into it, twisting her hands together in her lap while she worked up to the words. "I don't have a chocolate allergy. I never have." Hearing her say it out loud, plainly, in my own living room, still landed like a blow, even though some part of me had already known. "My mother told me for years you were a burden on our marriage," she went on, her voice cracking, "that you were draining us financially, that as long as you were around, I'd never really be a priority to your son, that a man who who was still that close to his father would always love someone more than he loved me. I believed her because she's my mother, and because some small, ugly part of me wanted an excuse to believe her. That cake wasn't about an allergy. It was never about that. It was about her wanting you gone, and me being weak enough to let her use me to do it. I sat very still, letting her get it all out. This was the part of the story I understood already, more or less, the shape of a controlling mother working on her daughter's insecurities the way water works on stone. What I didn't understand yet, what none of us understood yet, was how far that shaping had already gone, or what it had already set into motion behind our backs. She's been in my ear since before the wedding, she continued. Little things at first. Comments about how you'd always come first with him. Then bigger things. She'd get upset if we spent a holiday at your place instead of hers. She started asking questions about your finances a couple years back. Whether you had a will, whether the house was paid off, whether your son was named on anything. I thought it was just nosiness. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. What kind of questions? I asked, something cold settling low in my stomach that I couldn't quite name yet. She shook her head slowly. I don't fully know. She doesn't tell me everything anymore. Not since I started pulling away from her these last 2 weeks, but I know she's been talking to someone. A lawyer, I think, or some kind of consultant. She mentioned once that there were ways to protect a family's assets from an elderly parent who might not be thinking clearly forever. And I told her that was a horrible thing to say about you. And she just laughed and told me I'd understand someday when I was the one worrying about my own children's inheritance. I didn't say anything right away. It was one thing to imagine a mother-in-law who disliked me out of simple jealousy or control. It was another thing entirely to hear the words elderly parent and protect assets used in the same sentence about my own life, spoken by someone who'd never once asked me how I was actually doing. I don't want a divorce, she said, and now she was openly crying, the composure she'd walked in with completely gone. I don't want to lose my children, and more than anything, I don't want to lose your son. I love him. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything right now, but please, can you help me fix this with him? Your son is a good man, I told her gently. He loves you. If he didn't, he wouldn't have fought for you the way he did that night. He would have let you walk out the door and never called after you. He almost didn't, she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. He told me I had to make things right with you first, that whatever happened between us afterward, I owed you an apology before I owed him anything. That's my son, I said, feeling something warm move through the ache in my chest. Fair, even when it costs him something. He gets that from his mother, not from me. We talked for the better part of 2 hours that afternoon. She told me things about her childhood I hadn't known, about a mother who'd measured love and compliance, who made her feel like she needed her guidance to survive in the world, who'd systematically eroded her confidence in small increments so patient and steady she'd never noticed the floor dropping out from under her until she was already standing in the basement. It was a hard thing to hear, and harder still to reconcile with the woman who'd screamed at me across a birthday table 2 weeks earlier. But grief and manipulation don't always look the way you expect them to from the outside, and by the time she left that afternoon, I didn't see an enemy sitting across from me anymore. I saw someone who'd been used as a tool by somebody who should have protected her instead. A week later, my son called and invited me over for dinner, and I understood immediately what it meant. It was a test and an invitation, both at once. The house felt different when I walked in that evening, warmer than it had felt in the 2 weeks since the party. My daughter-in-law greeted me with a hug that finally felt genuine again, warm in a way it hadn't been in months, and my grandchildren came running before I'd even gotten my coat off, both of them talking over each other about their week at school. We sat down to a simple dinner, nothing fancy, and for the first time since the cake had landed in that trash can, the meal felt like something other than an obligation. Partway through dinner, my son reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Dad, he said, we've been talking a lot the last couple weeks. Really talking. She told me some of what she told you. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. We're going to figure this out, he continued. Together, all of us. Whatever her mother's been planning, we're not going to let it work. I didn't yet know how much planning there actually was. None of us did. We thought we were rebuilding something that had cracked from a single ugly night, a mother-in-law's jealousy finally boiling over into cruelty. We had no idea yet that the crack had been engineered years in advance, or that the woman who'd left my house in a fury that night had already set something else in motion long before she ever grabbed that cake. For a while, things actually seemed to be healing. My daughter-in-law came to Sunday dinners again, easier and warmer each week, and my son started dropping the kids off at my place on Saturday mornings the way they used to before all of this started. My granddaughter had taken to calling me every few days just to talk about nothing in particular, her voice full of the kind of ordinary chatter that felt like a small miracle after everything. It was on one of those calls, almost a month after the party, that she said something that snagged in my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite work loose. Grandma called Mommy again today, she said, matter of fact, the way kids report things without understanding their weight. She meant her other grandmother, her mother's mother, though none of us had used the word grandma for that woman since the night of the cake. Oh, I said carefully. What did she want? She was asking Mommy about your house, my granddaughter said. Like how big it is and if you live there by yourself and stuff. Mommy sounded kinda mad on the phone. I told myself it was nothing. Grandmothers ask nosy questions. It was the kind of thing I might have brushed past a month month earlier without a second thought. But something about the specificity of it, how big is the house and does he live there alone, sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't fully articulate, especially after what my daughter-in-law had told me on my couch a few weeks before, about assets and wills and elderly parents who might not always think clearly. I mentioned it to my son the next time he called, half expecting him to tell me I was being paranoid. He didn't. There was a long pause on the line instead. She asked me something similar a couple weeks ago, he said slowly. Whether you'd ever talked about downsizing, whether you had a financial advisor. I told her it wasn't any of her business and she dropped it, but now that you say that, now what? I asked. Now I'm wondering if she actually dropped it, he said, or if she just stopped asking me directly. My son didn't say anything to his wife about it right away. Instead, over the following 2 weeks, he started paying closer attention, the way you do once a splinter's worked its way under the skin and you can't stop probing at it even though you know it'll hurt. He noticed her mother had stopped calling the house line entirely and started calling my daughter-in-law's cell phone instead, always in the afternoons when he was still at work. He noticed that when he asked casually how her mother was doing, she'd give short, careful answers, the kind you give when you're managing what someone else hears rather than actually answering. He noticed one evening while helping her clean out a drawer in the hallway desk, an envelope addressed to her mother from a law office in the next county over, already opened, the letter itself missing. He didn't mention it to me for another week, not wanting to alarm me over what might still turn out to be nothing, but he mentioned it to his wife directly, one night after the kids were asleep, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard genuine fear in his voice when he called to tell me about her reaction. She said she didn't know what letter I meant, he told me. But Dad, her hands were shaking when she said it. I've been married to her for 9 years. I know what her lying looks like, and that wasn't confusion on her face. That was fear. Fear of what? I asked. I don't know yet, he said, but she promised me she'd find out. She said if her mother's actually done something, she wants to be the one to bring it to us, not have us find it some other way. 3 days passed without word. Then, on a Thursday afternoon while I was out at the grocery store, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and unfamiliar, asking to confirm she was speaking with the correct person regarding an account matter that required my signature verification. I told her she must have the wrong number. I hadn't signed anything requiring verification in months. There was a pause on her end, the particular pause of someone double-checking a file. I have documentation here showing your signature from 3 weeks ago, she said slowly. Sir, are you telling me you didn't sign these papers? My hands went cold around the phone. No, I said. I haven't signed anything in months. What documents are you talking about? The woman on the line hesitated, and I could hear her pulling something up on her screen. Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to our Elder Services department. I don't want to alarm you, but I do want you to stay on the line. I stood in the parking lot of the grocery store, my cart of half-bagged groceries abandoned by the car, while a second voice came on the line and explained, slowly and carefully, that a request had come through their office 3 weeks earlier to process paperwork related to a durable power of attorney, filed along with a supporting letter suggesting I may be experiencing early signs of cognitive decline and could benefit from having a trusted family member manage my financial affairs going forward. Whose name is listed as the trusted family member? I asked, though some part of me already knew before she answered, the same cold feeling settling into my stomach that had started when my granddaughter mentioned a phone call about the size of my house. She told me it wasn't my son's name on the form, it was her mother's. I don't remember driving home. I remember calling my son from my driveway before I'd even gotten out of the car, my voice shaking so badly he had to ask me to slow down and start over twice before he understood what I was telling him. I remember him going completely silent on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a man doing math he desperately didn't want to be doing. I'm coming to get you, he finally said, right now. We're going to that office together, and we're going to see this paperwork with our own eyes. He picked me up 20 minutes later, his face pale and set in a way I'd only seen once before, the night he'd stood between his wife and his own father over a ruined cake. My daughter-in-law had wanted to come too, but he'd asked her to stay home with the kids, and I understood, without either of us saying it out loud, that he wasn't yet completely certain how much she'd known and how much she hadn't. The drive to the bank's regional office took 40 minutes. Neither of us said much. I kept thinking about a woman I'd cooked breakfast for on Christmas mornings for 9 years, a woman who'd sat at my table and eaten slices of cake I'd made with my late wife's recipe, quietly deciding somewhere along the way that the best use for me was as a name to be signed away. The woman from Elder Services met us in a small conference room with beige walls and a box of tissues already sitting in the middle of the table, the kind of detail that told me this wasn't the first time she'd had this exact conversation with someone else's frightened family. She slid a folder across to us and opened it without ceremony. There it was, my name, typed neatly at the top of a durable power of attorney form. A signature at the bottom that curved in almost the right places, close enough that a stranger glancing quickly might not think twice about it, but wrong in the small ways that mattered. The loop on the first letter tilted a direction. My hand had never once tilted it in 71 years of writing my own name. Beside it sat a second document, a letter on the letterhead of a doctor's office I'd never visited in my life, describing symptoms I'd never reported to anyone, memory lapses and confusion, and difficulty managing daily tasks, none of which had ever come out of my mouth to a single medical professional. My son's hand tightened tightened on the back of my chair hard enough that I heard the wood creak. "Sir," the woman said gently, "can you confirm for me that this is not your signature?" I stared at that curved, almost right loop for a long moment, feeling something in my chest go very quiet and very cold, the particular stillness that comes right before real anger, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "I never signed this power of attorney in my life," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to, steadier than I felt. The woman nodded slowly, like she'd already suspected as much from the moment I said I hadn't signed anything. "Then I need you to know this has already moved further than a paperwork error," she said. "The account restructuring request tied to this document was scheduled to finalize in 11 days. Someone has been building toward transferring managing control of your assets for weeks." My son had gone completely white beside me. "Who submitted this?" he asked, though I could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer as surely as I did, and was only asking so someone else would have to be the one to say her name out loud first, so that neither of us would have to be the one who broke whatever was left unbroken between our two families by saying it ourselves. "Her mother," the woman from Elder Services confirmed, turning the folder so we could both see the name typed clean and deliberate at the bottom of the form, right beside that almost right signature that wasn't mine. "She's listed as the filing party and the proposed agent, along with a physician's letter that, I have to tell you, doesn't match any provider currently in our verified network. We flagged it for that reason before it ever reached final processing." 11 days. She'd given herself 11 days to finish signing away my house, my accounts, whatever was left of the life I'd built with my late wife, to a woman who'd looked at me across a birthday cake and decided I was worth less than the frosting she'd scraped into a trash can. My son called his wife from the parking lot, and I listened to half a conversation I never wanted to hear, his voice cracking open in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy, telling her what we'd found, watching her world rearrange itself in real time over the phone the same way mine already had an hour earlier. She was already crying before he finished the second sentence. Whatever she had or hadn't known before that afternoon, I could hear in the sound she made that this specific piece, the forged signature, the fake doctor's letter, the 11-day countdown, was as much a gut punch to her as it had been to us. We drove to her mother's house that same evening, all three of us in my son's car, nobody speaking, the folder from the bank sitting on my lap like something radioactive. She answered the door in her robe, a glass of wine already in her hand, and for one full second before she saw the folder, her face still wore that same small, satisfied smile I remembered from the night of the cake. Then she saw what my son was holding, and the smile didn't so much fall as freeze. The muscles in her face caught somewhere between denial and the beginning of understanding that the ground she'd been standing on for weeks had just given out beneath her. "You had no right," my son said, and his voice was very quiet, quieter than it had been the night he told her to leave my house, quiet in the specific way that meant every ounce of the anger he'd been carrying since that birthday party had finally arrived somewhere with nowhere left to go but straight at her. "You forged my father's signature. You invented a diagnosis he never had. You gave yourself 11 days to take everything he has left in this world." "I was protecting this family," she started, but the words came out thin, already collapsing under their own weight before she'd even finished the sentence. "You were protecting yourself," my daughter-in-law said, and I turned to look at her, standing beside her husband with tears still wet on her face, her voice shaking but not breaking. "You spent years telling me his father was the threat to our family. The whole time, it was you. It was always you." Her mother opened her mouth to answer, and for the first time in all the months I'd known her, I watched her realize she had absolutely nothing left to say.